The sun had just started to climb over the quiet streets of the small town. The roads were still empty, except for a few cars moving lazily through the morning light. It was one of those calm days when the world seemed slow, unhurried, and peaceful. But sometimes peace hides moments that change everything. At the edge of town, a police car rolled slowly down a two-lane road. Inside sat Officer Reed, a man who had been on the force for almost 15 years. He was known by his co-workers as someone who followed the rules strictly, maybe too strictly. He believed he could tell what kind of person someone was just by looking at them. That belief had caused him to make mistakes before, but he never saw them as mistakes. He thought he was just being careful. He sipped his coffee, scanning the cars passing by. His eyes stopped on a black SUV ahead of him. It was moving a little slower than the rest, steady and careful. There was nothing suspicious about it, but something about it caught his attention. Maybe it was just instinct, he told himself. Maybe it was the tinted windows. Or maybe it was just that quiet, uneasy thought he often carried, the kind that made him look for trouble where there wasn't any. The SUV turned onto a quiet street lined with trees. Officer Reed followed, his curiosity growing. After a few more turns, he decided to switch on his lights. The red and blue reflection bounced off the car's windows as it slowed and pulled over to the side of the road. Inside the SUV sat a man in his late 40s. His face was calm, his expression patient. He was on his way home after attending a leadership conference at a nearby military base. His name was General David Carter. He wasn't in uniform that day, just a plain button-up shirt and dark jeans. His posture was straight, his movements slow and careful, the way someone trained to stay calm under pressure would act. When he saw the flashing lights behind him, he didn't panic. He had been stopped before, usually for minor things like a missing taillight or a routine check. He reached calmly into his glove compartment, took out his driver's license and registration, and waited for the officer to approach. Outside, Officer Reed stepped out of his car, adjusting his belt and hat. He walked toward the SUV slowly, his eyes sharp. As he approached the driver's window, he noticed the man's composed expression and the neatness of the car's interior. But instead of seeing calm professionalism, Reed saw something else: suspicion. "License and registration," he said, his tone short and firm. The man handed them over without hesitation. "Of course, officer."
"May I ask what this is about?"
His voice was calm, deep, and polite. Reed didn't answer right away. He looked over the documents, scanning them carefully, though nothing seemed wrong. "You were driving a little too slow back there," he said finally. The man nodded slightly. "Yes, sir. I wasn't in a rush. Just making sure I didn't miss the turn for the highway." Reed narrowed his eyes. He didn't like how relaxed the man seemed. Most people fidgeted or looked nervous when stopped by police, but this man was calm. Too calm, Reed thought. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Home," the man replied simply. "Just finished a conference at Fort Harper." Reed glanced at him. "Fort Harper? Military?" "Yes. What do you do there?" "I work in administration," the man said carefully. He didn't like to talk about his position unless necessary. Years in service had taught him humility. He didn't need to announce who he was to be respected. Reed studied him for a moment longer. "Step out of the car, please." The man looked at him, puzzled. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Just step out of the car," Reed repeated, his tone sharper this time. The man sighed softly, not out of anger, but disappointment. He had seen moments like this before, moments when patience would matter more than pride. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out. Reed's hand hovered near his holster out of habit. The man noticed but said nothing. He kept his hands visible and his voice calm. "Officer, I assure you I haven't done anything wrong." Reed ignored that.
"Do you have any weapons or illegal items in the vehicle?"
"No, sir. Would you mind if I take a look?" The man hesitated. "With respect, officer, I don't see any reason for a search." Reed's expression hardened. "Are you refusing to comply?" "I'm simply asking if there's probable cause," the man said, keeping his voice even. He wasn't trying to challenge authority, only to ask for fairness. But fairness wasn't what Reed was thinking about. To him, the man's calm tone sounded defiant. He took a step closer, his body tense. The man didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't do anything that could be seen as aggressive. He just stood there quietly waiting. Cars passed slowly in the distance, their drivers glancing briefly before driving off. The road was quiet again. The air between the two men grew heavier with each passing second. Finally, Reed spoke again, his tone controlled but cold. "I'll run your information. Stay right here." He walked back to his car, typing the man's details into the computer. Everything came back clean. No record, no violations, no warnings, nothing. The license was valid, the registration matched, and the insurance was current. There was absolutely no reason to detain him, but Reed sat there staring at the screen. Something inside him refused to let it go. He had built a habit of distrusting what looked too perfect, too composed. It was a mindset that had followed him for years, one that told him some people just didn't belong in certain places, no matter how polite they seemed. He got out again and walked back toward the man. "You sure you don't have anything in the car I should know about?" The man looked at him steadily. "Nothing at all, officer. You're welcome to check if you have a warrant." Reed's jaw tightened. "I don't need one if you give me permission." "And I respect that," the man replied. "But I'd prefer if we followed procedure." Reed stared at him for a long moment. He couldn't explain why he felt so uneasy. The man wasn't doing anything wrong, yet every calm word felt like a challenge to his authority. "Stay here," he said again, walking back to his car. As he stood there, another patrol car drove by and stopped. A second officer stepped out, younger and visibly unsure. "Everything okay, Reed?" he asked. "Just checking something," Reed said quickly. "Driver's acting strange." The younger officer glanced at the man standing by the SUV. He didn't see anything strange. The man stood straight, hands visible, eyes steady. "Looks calm to me," the young officer said. Reed didn't answer. He turned back to the man. "What did you say your name was again?" "David Carter," the man replied. Reed repeated it quietly to himself. Something about the name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. "Do you have any proof you work for the military?" he asked. The man nodded and reached slowly into his wallet, pulling out his military ID. He handed it over carefully. Reed glanced at it briefly before shaking his head. "This could be fake," he said. The young officer frowned. "It looks real to me." Reed ignored him. "I'm going to verify this," he said. The man sighed again, his patience beginning to wear thin. "Officer, I've told you the truth. I've been nothing but cooperative. Is there any reason this stop is taking so long?" Reed looked up sharply. "You're not the one asking questions here." The air went still again. The man didn't argue. He just took a small step back and waited. His composure was unshaken, though anyone else might have shouted or walked away by now. Years of training in difficult situations had taught him one thing: never let anger decide your next move. Minutes passed. Finally, Reed's radio buzzed. A voice came through, confirming the man's identity. The name matched, the credentials matched, and his rank was confirmed: General David Carter, United States Army. Reed froze for a second, the words echoing in his mind. "General?" The young officer's eyes widened. "He's a general?" "As in—" "Yes," the radio voice interrupted. "Highly decorated, long service record currently attached to Fort Harper." "Is there an issue?" Reed didn't answer. He turned slowly toward the man, who stood exactly where he had been all along. Calm, patient, composed. The realization hit Reed hard. The man he had doubted, the one he had treated with suspicion, was someone who had spent his entire life serving the very country Reed claimed to protect. The younger officer stepped forward awkwardly. "Sir, I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding," he said quickly. The general gave a small nod. "It's all right. I understand." But Reed stood there, his pride fighting against the weight of embarrassment. He handed the documents back stiffly, muttering, "You're free to go." The general took them quietly. "Thank you, officer," he said softly, and with a small nod he returned to his vehicle. As the SUV pulled away, Reed watched it disappear down the road. His chest felt heavy. He wanted to believe he had done his job correctly, but deep down he knew better. There had been no reason for the stop, no reason for suspicion, only an assumption. The younger officer looked at him. "You okay?" Reed didn't answer. He just stared at the empty road. The sound of the fading engine echoed in his ears longer than it should have. Later that evening, as Reed sat in his patrol car alone, he replayed the moment over and over. The calmness of the man, the quiet disappointment in his voice, the weight of that single word. General. He had always thought he understood what justice meant. But for the first time he felt something he hadn't felt before, doubt. And though he didn't know it yet, that doubt would grow into something much larger, something that would change not only his life, but the way his entire town understood fairness and respect. The day had started like any other, but by nightfall it had become a story no one would forget. The evening light was fading and the quiet of the small police station felt heavier than usual. The man they had just brought in sat calmly on a metal bench in the corner of the room. His hands rested on his knees, steady and composed. He didn't speak, didn't complain, didn't even seem angry. The air carried the sound of papers rustling and a distant ringing phone, but nothing felt normal. Everyone could sense something was off. The officer who had made the arrest sat behind his desk, trying to look busy with his report. He wrote down words that didn't make much sense, his thoughts running in circles. The image of the man's calm face kept returning to his mind. Something about that silence bothered him more than any argument would have. The man sitting there wasn't just quiet. He carried himself with a quiet strength. His shoulders were straight, his eyes clear. Even in that uncomfortable chair, he had the posture of someone used to command. It was as if he belonged somewhere else, somewhere with respect and order, not this small holding room under flickering lights. After a while, he finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, and polite. "Officer," he said, "can I ask what this is all about?" The officer didn't answer right away. He stared at his papers, pretending to write. "Routine check," he muttered. "Routine check?" The man repeated softly. "You pointed a gun at me for driving too slowly?" The question hung in the air like a weight. The officer didn't look up. Deep down, he knew there was no real answer. He had acted on something he couldn't justify, something he didn't even want to admit to himself. A younger officer sitting nearby shifted uncomfortably. He had watched the whole thing and hadn't liked any part of it. He had seen many stops before, but this one felt wrong from the start. The man in front of them didn't behave like someone hiding anything. His calmness didn't come from arrogance. It came from discipline. The younger officer spoke up quietly. "Sir," he said to his colleague, "I think you should check his ID again." The older officer frowned. "I already did." "Maybe look at it properly," the younger one said, his tone firm but respectful. With a sigh, the officer picked up the wallet again and looked more carefully at the card inside. His eyes moved slowly across the name and then froze. There was a seal, an emblem, a title printed in small, bold letters. U.S. Army General. His breath caught for a second. He looked up at the man who was watching him quietly. "You're in the military?" he asked. "I am," the man said. "Has been a long time." The room went silent. Even the distant ringing phone stopped for a moment, as if the world was listening. The officer's hand trembled slightly as he set the ID down. His face lost color. He had handcuffed a U.S. Army general, someone who had spent decades serving the very country he was sworn to protect. "I didn't know," the officer said finally. "I understand," the man replied, "but I hoped you would listen before judging." The younger officer looked down, unsure what to do next. The words stung because they were true. The general hadn't raised his voice once, but every sentence carried weight. It wasn't about anger. It was about dignity. A door opened at the end of the hall and the sergeant in charge stepped in. He was an older man, the kind who didn't waste time. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking from the officer to the man sitting calmly. "Why is he still cuffed?" No one spoke for a moment. The older officer opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. The sergeant took the ID, looked at it, and his expression changed instantly. "Good heavens," he muttered. "General Carter?" "Yes," the man said quietly. The sergeant's tone softened immediately. "Sir, I am deeply sorry. This shouldn't have happened." He motioned for the cuffs to be removed. The younger officer hurried over and unlocked them. The metal clicked and the general rubbed his wrists gently. He didn't show any anger, just tiredness, the kind that comes from having seen this kind of thing before. "Can I go now?" he asked simply. "Of course," the sergeant said. "We'll escort you to your vehicle." "Again, we're very sorry." As he stood up, the general looked directly at the officer who had arrested him. Their eyes met for a long moment. The officer wanted to say something, an apology, an excuse, anything, but no words came. The general gave a small nod and said, "I hope you think about this, not for me, but for the next person." Then he turned and walked out. The younger officer followed him out to the parking lot. The night air was cool and the sound of crickets filled the silence between them. "Sir," the young officer said, "I just want you to know not everyone here sees people like that." The general smiled faintly. "I know, you did the right thing tonight. Keep doing that." When the general drove away, the younger officer stood there for a while, watching the taillights fade down the street. He felt both proud and uneasy. Proud that he spoke up. Uneasy that he had to. Inside the station, the atmosphere had changed. Whispers floated through the hall. Everyone had heard. The sergeant stood in the doorway of his office and looked at the officer who had made the arrest. "You're writing a full report," he said. "Every detail. And be honest." The officer nodded slowly. He felt hollow. His stomach was tight, his thoughts heavy. He kept hearing the general's voice in his head. "I expected you to listen." He didn't shout it. He didn't accuse. But those words echoed louder than any lecture. That night, the officer couldn't sleep. He sat alone in his living room with the TV on, but the sound turned off. He replayed every moment. The flashing lights, the raised voice, the calmness he mistook for defiance. He had been so sure he was doing his job. But now, all he could see was how wrong he had been. Across town, General Carter sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea. His wife had gone to bed early, but he stayed up staring at the cup as the steam faded. He had been through harder days, seen tougher things, but somehow this small event had cut deeper. It wasn't the arrest, it was what it meant. It was the reminder that even after serving his country, he could still be seen as suspicious just for existing. But he wasn't bitter. He had learned long ago that anger doesn't change minds. Example does. He decided he would handle it differently. He wouldn't demand punishment or public outrage. He would ask for a conversation. The next day, news started to spread. Someone nearby had recorded the entire incident on their phone. It wasn't violent or dramatic, but it was powerful. The video showed the general standing calmly as he was handcuffed, speaking with quiet respect and the uncomfortable officer beside him. The internet reacted quickly. People shared it, commented, and demanded answers. At the police station, phones rang non-stop. Reporters called for statements. Community leaders wanted meetings. The chief gathered everyone for a quick briefing. "We need to be transparent," he said. "This isn't going away." The officer sat in the back of the room, quiet and pale. His mistake was no longer private. It was on screens, in conversations, and across headlines. His mind wasn't on the media, though. It was still on the general's calm voice and the shame that came with it. Later that evening, General Carter received a call from the mayor's office, inviting him to speak at a community forum about respect and bias. He didn't hesitate. He had nothing to prove but something to teach. A week later, the hall was full. People of all ages came to listen. Cameras lined the back of the room. Carter stood on stage not in uniform, just in a simple suit. When he spoke, his voice carried warmth and quiet strength. "Respect," he said, "should not depend on how someone looks or what they wear. It should be given because we're all human. If we can see each other as people first, everything else becomes easier." The room was silent, listening closely. Even those who came out of curiosity felt the weight of his words. Among the crowd, unnoticed, sat the officer who had arrested him. He had come in plain clothes, sitting near the back, his hands folded tightly. He didn't know why he came, only that he needed to hear it. As the speech ended and people began to clap, the officer stayed seated. He felt something shift inside him, something uncomfortable but important. It wasn't just regret anymore. It was understanding. He had learned something he could never forget. When the hall emptied, the general stayed to shake hands and talk to people. The officer waited until the crowd thinned, then slowly walked toward the stage. He didn't know what he would say or if he should even speak, but the moment felt right. Before he could open his mouth, the general noticed him. Their eyes met again. This time there was no judgment, just quiet recognition. The officer didn't need to explain. His presence was enough. The general gave a small nod and the officer returned it, feeling a strange sense of peace. It didn't erase what happened, but it was a start. And sometimes a start is all it takes for change to begin. The story spread faster than anyone expected. What started as a quiet night in a small police station had turned into something much larger. The video of the arrest, showing a calm man in handcuffs and an officer who had made a quick judgment, was everywhere. People were sharing it on social media, talking about it on the news, and arguing about what it meant. Some were angry, some were disappointed, some simply couldn't believe it had happened. The general didn't want attention. He hadn't spoken to reporters or posted anything online. He spent his days quietly at home, focusing on his work and his family. But the story wouldn't leave him alone. Reporters waited outside his gate. Neighbors stopped him at the grocery store. Strangers wrote him letters, some offering apologies, others sharing their own stories of unfair treatment. It was overwhelming, but he handled it the only way he knew how, with calm and grace. At the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers spoke in low voices, careful not to say too much. Every time the phone rang, it was another call from the press or someone demanding answers. The chief held several meetings, repeating the same message over and over. "We made a mistake. Now we fix it." But not everyone knew what that meant. Some officers defended their colleague, saying he was just doing his job. Others stayed quiet, unsure of what to think. The officer who made the arrest felt the pressure most of all. His name was in the papers now, though not in the way anyone wanted. He didn't look at the comments online anymore. The few he saw were enough to make him sick. Some called him a racist. Some called him worse. He didn't know what to say because deep down he didn't know how to defend himself. He hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But he also couldn't deny that his actions came from a place of assumption, not fact. He stopped sleeping well. Every night the scene replayed in his head. The flashing lights, the calm man in the driver's seat, the words he couldn't take back. He wished he could start over, handle it differently, listen instead of assume. But life didn't offer do-overs, only lessons. The general, meanwhile, began receiving calls from officials, local leaders, city council members, even a senator. They wanted him to speak publicly, to share his side of the story. At first he refused. He wasn't interested in politics or public attention. But as the days went on and he saw how the story was dividing people, he realized he couldn't stay silent forever. He agreed to speak at a town meeting organized by community leaders. The goal was simple: bring people together to talk, not to argue. The event was set for the following weekend at a local community center. The mayor promised to attend, along with members of the police department. Word spread quickly, and soon people from neighboring towns said they would come too. The night before the meeting, the officer sat at his kitchen table, staring at the invitation he'd received. He wasn't sure if he should go. Part of him wanted to stay home to avoid the stares and whispers, but another part of him knew he needed to be there, maybe not to speak, but to listen. He owed that much. The next morning, the community center was full. Rows of chairs stretched across the hall, and people stood along the walls when the seats filled up. There were reporters in the back, cameras ready, but most of the crowd was just ordinary people, parents, students, veterans, and neighbors. They were there to understand, not to argue. When the general entered, the room grew quiet. He wasn't wearing his uniform, just a simple dark suit. He walked to the front, nodded politely to the mayor, and took his place at the microphone. His voice was steady when he began to speak. "I didn't come here for sympathy," he said. "I came here for understanding. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone, not because of who I am, but because every person deserves respect." He paused, letting the words settle. "I've served this country for over 30 years. I've seen people from every background, every belief stand side by side for something bigger than themselves. That's what makes this country strong. Not fear, not suspicion, but respect." The room was silent except for the sound of his voice. Even the cameras stopped clicking for a moment. He spoke about what it felt like to be treated as a suspect in the land he had served, and about how small actions, words, glances, assumptions, could build walls between people without them even realizing it. Then he did something no one expected. He said, "The officer who arrested me made a mistake, but I don't hate him. I don't want his life destroyed. I want him to learn, to grow, to understand, because that's how change happens, not through anger, but through awareness." The crowd murmured quietly. Some nodded, some wiped their eyes. The mayor looked down at his hands. At the back of the room, the officer listened, every word sinking deep into him. He felt both ashamed and grateful. Ashamed because the man he had wronged was still showing him more grace than he deserved, and grateful because he had been given a chance to learn instead of being condemned. After the speech, people lined up to shake the general's hand, thank him, or share their own stories. The officer stayed seated for a while, waiting until the crowd thinned out. Then hesitantly he stood and walked toward the front. The general noticed him right away. Their eyes met. For a moment no one spoke. Then the officer said quietly, "Sir, I came here to say I'm sorry. I know sorry doesn't fix it, but I mean it." The general studied him for a moment before answering. Apologies matter when they come from understanding, not fear. "Do you understand now?" The officer nodded slowly. "I do. I thought I was doing my job. But I see now I was seeing through a narrow lens. I was trained to look for danger, but I forgot to look for people." The general gave a small nod. "That's a start." They stood in silence for a few seconds. Then the general extended his hand. The officer hesitated before taking it. The handshake wasn't dramatic or forced. It was simple, human. A sign that one man was willing to forgive and the other was willing to change. A few people nearby saw the exchange and clapped softly. Others joined in. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried meaning. It wasn't about victory or defeat. It was about growth. After the meeting, the officer went home and sat in his car for a long time before going inside. He felt lighter somehow, though he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The department had already announced there would be an internal review. He didn't know if he would keep his job. But whatever happened, he wanted to be better, to understand people beyond what his training had taught him. The next few weeks brought more attention. News outlets praised the general's calm response and his message of forgiveness. Some called it a turning point for the town. The police department announced new training programs focused on empathy and cultural awareness. It wasn't just about rules and policies anymore. It was about people. The general was invited to speak at schools, community events, and police academies. He didn't always accept, but when he did, he spoke with the same steady tone, firm but kind. "We can't fix everything overnight," he would say, "but we can start by listening." One evening, the general received a letter in the mail. It had no return address, just his name neatly written on the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "Sir, I wanted to thank you for giving me a chance to grow. I've started volunteering at youth programs and attending workshops on communication and bias. I can't undo what I did, but I can make sure I never repeat it. You taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn. M.R." The general read the letter twice, then set it down with a small smile. He didn't reply, but he kept the letter in his desk drawer, where he could see it whenever he needed a reminder of what patience could do. Months passed. The story slowly faded from headlines, replaced by new events, new debates. But its impact lingered quietly in the community. The police department changed its approach. Officers started spending more time talking to residents, visiting schools, and participating in local programs. The general saw it as progress, not perfection, but a step forward. One warm afternoon, he attended a charity event at the local park. Families gathered under tents, kids played nearby, and music played softly in the background. As he walked through the crowd, someone called out to him. It was the officer. He wasn't in uniform. He wore casual clothes and a small smile that looked both nervous and sincere. "General," he said, walking up, "I wanted to tell you I'm part of the new training program now. We're teaching new recruits about communication, about seeing people first. It's been different." "In a good way," the general nodded. "That's good to hear." "I also talk about that night," the officer said. "Not to make excuses, but to show how one bad choice can change how you see the world." The general looked at him for a long moment, then said, "If your story helps others understand, then it's worth sharing." They stood there for a while. The noise of the park around them, children laughing, dogs barking, music playing softly. It was an ordinary moment, but to both men it felt like something more. A reminder that even from pain, something good could grow if people were willing to listen and learn. Later that day, as the sun set and the crowd began to leave, the general sat on a bench near the edge of the park. He thought about how far things had come since that night. The anger, the shame, the misunderstanding, and how it had slowly turned into something meaningful. He realized that real change doesn't come from big speeches or headlines. It comes from small choices made every day by people who decide to see each other as equals. He smiled quietly to himself, feeling at peace. The world wasn't perfect, but it was moving, slowly, surely, in the right direction. The weeks after the town meeting felt different for everyone. For the first time in a long while, the small city seemed to breathe together instead of pulling apart. People were still talking about what had happened, But now the tone had shifted. It wasn't anger anymore. It was reflection. There were discussions in coffee shops, schools, and churches about respect, empathy, and how one mistake could teach an entire community something new. The general continued his quiet life. He didn't seek the spotlight. He went on morning walks, spent time with his family, and answered calls from people who wanted to thank him. But what he valued most were the letters from young people, students, soldiers, and even police recruits. They wrote about how his story changed the way they saw others, how they were learning to pause before judging someone. Those letters made him realize something powerful. Sometimes one calm act can reach farther than anger ever could. He received an invitation one morning from a nearby police academy. The letter was polite, asking if he would consider speaking to the graduating class of new officers. The message was signed by the academy's director, who mentioned that one of their instructors had recommended him personally. When the general looked at the signature, his eyes paused. It was the same officer who had once arrested him. For a moment, he sat still, the letter in his hand. He wasn't angry. In fact, he felt a quiet sense of pride. The man had changed, and not just on paper. He was using his experience to guide others. After a long breath, the general decided to accept the invitation. The day of the ceremony arrived with clear skies and a soft breeze. The academy yard was filled with young cadets in crisp uniforms, their families watching proudly from the stands. The sound of music played from a small band near the flagpole. When the general stepped onto the stage, the chatter faded. Many of the cadets had seen the video from months before, but few had expected to see the man from the story standing in front of them. He began speaking slowly, his voice even and warm. "I stand before you today not because I wear medals or carry a title, but because I learned something important the hard way. How easily we can forget that the people we protect are human, just like us." He looked across the crowd at faces full of hope and nervous energy. "Every uniform represents trust. And that trust," he continued, "is fragile. It's earned through how you treat others, especially when no one's watching." The audience listened quietly. Even the wind seemed to still for a moment. He spoke about the importance of patience, of seeing people beyond assumptions. He didn't mention his arrest directly, but everyone knew what he meant. When his speech ended, there was no loud applause right away. Just a moment of thoughtful silence, then a wave of clapping that grew stronger and stronger. The young officers stood and saluted him, a gesture of respect not for his rank but for his message. After the ceremony, the officer who had once arrested him approached from behind the stage. He looked nervous but also more at peace than before. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. The cadets needed to hear that. "Honestly, I needed to hear it again too," the general smiled. "You're doing good work. Keep at it," the officer nodded. "I try to remind them that power doesn't make you strong. Understanding does. I learned that from you." The general chuckled softly. "We both learned that lesson, just from different sides of the same moment." That evening, the general drove home feeling lighter. The sunset painted the sky orange and gold, and he rolled down his window to feel the cool wind. Life, he thought, had a way of teaching lessons that no book or uniform could. Over the following months, the community saw small but meaningful changes. The police department launched new programs where officers visited local schools to talk about safety and respect. They hosted open events where residents could ask questions and share experiences. The walls between people began to thin. The general often attended these events quietly, sitting in the back and listening. He didn't always speak, but when he did, his words carried the kind of weight that came only from experience. He told young officers to see their badges not as shields but as promises, to serve, not to control. One afternoon, the general received a call from a university that was organizing a leadership conference. They wanted him to give a talk on integrity and service. He wasn't sure at first, but then he remembered all the young people who had written to him. Maybe, he thought, this was another chance to make a difference. When the day came, he stood on stage before hundreds of students. He spoke about his life, his time in the army, and the lessons learned from both war and peace. But when he came to the part about the arrest, he didn't dwell on blame. Instead, he talked about forgiveness. Forgiveness, he said, is not about letting someone escape responsibility. It's about freeing yourself from anger. When you forgive, you make room for change, not only in others but in yourself. The student sat quietly, absorbing his words. After the talk, many of them came up to shake his hand and thank him. One young woman said, "I used to think strength meant fighting back. Now I see it can also mean staying calm." The general smiled. "Calm doesn't mean weakness," he replied. "It means control. And sometimes that's the strongest thing you can have." As the months passed, the once controversial story became something different. A lesson. Schools used it as an example of growth. Police training programs discussed it as a case study in communication and respect. What had started as a painful experience became a bridge between two worlds that rarely understood each other. The officer continued his teaching at the academy. His lessons were not just about law or procedure anymore. He spoke about perspective, empathy, and humanity. He often told new recruits, "Your authority comes from how you treat people, not how you control them." Sometimes he still felt the weight of what had happened. It was not something he could erase, but he had learned to carry it as a reminder, a constant lesson that kept him grounded. One weekend during a community event, the general and the officer were both invited to a panel discussion about trust between citizens and police. They sat side by side answering questions from the audience. At one point, a young man in the crowd asked, "How did you both move past what happened?" The general looked thoughtful before answering. "By understanding that growth doesn't come from comfort," he said. "It comes from facing what went wrong and choosing to do better." The officer added, "And by listening." I didn't just hear him that day. I really listened, and that changed everything. The audience clapped softly. The two men shared a small smile, not one of triumph, but of mutual respect. After the event, the general walked through the crowd, shaking hands and talking with residents. Some thanked him for his courage, others for his kindness. He didn't see himself as brave, though. He saw himself as human, just someone who refused to let anger win. That night, as he sat at home with his family, he felt grateful. The world hadn't changed overnight, but hearts were opening, minds were shifting. He realized that one moment of injustice had become a spark for awareness, and that gave him hope. A few months later, the officer visited the general's home. It wasn't an official visit, just a friendly one. He brought coffee and 2 sandwiches, saying, "Thought we could talk man to man." They sat on the porch, the sound of birds filling the quiet air. For a while they didn't speak, just sat in easy silence. Then the officer said, "I used to think respect came with the badge, but now I know it has to be earned every day in every interaction." The general nodded. "That's true. Respect doesn't come from a title. It comes from how you treat people when no one's watching." The officer smiled faintly. "You've been a better teacher than I ever expected." The general chuckled. "And you've been a better student than you realize." They laughed together. Two men who had once stood on opposite sides of misunderstanding, now connected through something far stronger, understanding. As the sun began to set, the officer stood to leave. "You know," he said, "that night it used to be the worst memory of my life. Now I think it's the most important one." The general smiled. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that change us the most. He watched as the officer walked down the path, his figure fading into the evening light. There was peace in knowing that what began as pain had turned into progress. That night the general stood by his window, looking out at the quiet street. He thought about all the people who had been touched by what happened, the cadets, the students, the townspeople, even the officer. The world still had problems, of course. There was still prejudice, still misunderstanding. But he believed that as long as people were willing to listen, there was hope. He whispered softly to himself. Change begins with listening. And somewhere across town, the officer sat at his own kitchen table, thinking the same words. It wasn't about one mistake anymore. It was about what came after, the courage to face it, to learn and to grow. And that, in the quiet simplicity of life, was how healing truly began. Months had passed since the day the general and the officer last met on the porch. The town had slowly settled into a new rhythm. The noise that once surrounded their story had faded, but its lessons stayed alive in quiet ways. Every person who had watched it unfold carried a small piece of it with them, a reminder that how we treat each other defines who we are. The general had gone back to his calm, steady life. He spent mornings tending to his small garden, watering the flowers his wife loved and taking slow walks through the neighborhood. People often stopped to greet him, not because of his title, but because of the kindness he always returned. Some of them were strangers who still remembered the video that once shook the town, But now they saw him as more than the man from that story. They saw him as someone who had turned pain into purpose. He had begun volunteering at a local youth center. Every Friday afternoon, he would sit with a group of teenagers and talk to them about choices, respect, and self-control. They listened closely when he spoke, not because he was famous, but because his words came from the heart. He told them, "Life will test your patience, your pride, and your beliefs. But if you stay calm, if you choose respect when anger feels easier, you'll always find peace." The young people liked how simple he made it sound. They felt comfortable around him because he never lectured them. He just told stories, no real ones, about what he had seen and learned. One Friday evening after the session, a boy stayed behind. He looked unsure, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. The general waited patiently. Finally, the boy said, "My brother wants to be a police officer, but he's scared people will think he's the bad guy before he even starts." The general nodded thoughtfully. "Tell your brother this," he said. "The world always needs good people in uniforms. If he joins with the right heart, he can help change how people see that badge. Tell him not to be afraid. Tell him to be the example." The boy smiled and thanked him before running off. The general watched him go, feeling a quiet sense of hope. Sometimes he thought small talks could plant the biggest seeds. Meanwhile, across town, the officer's life had also changed. He had become one of the most respected instructors at the police academy. His students said he was strict but fair. He talked openly about his past mistakes, not to make excuses, but to teach. "The day you stop learning," he often told them, "is the day you stop being fit to serve." One afternoon, after finishing his class, he sat alone in his office looking out the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the training field. The laughter of young cadets echoed in the distance. He thought about how much his life had changed, how one mistake had forced him to look at himself differently. It hadn't been easy, but it had made him better. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the general's number. For a moment he hesitated. Then he sent a simple message. "You once said change begins when you see people for who they are. I finally understand what that means. Thank you." He didn't expect a reply, but a few minutes later his phone buzzed. "I'm glad to hear that. Keep walking the right path. The world needs more people willing to grow." He smiled, putting his phone down. It wasn't just a message, it felt like a handshake across distance and time. Over the next few months, their paths crossed occasionally at community events or charity drives. They didn't need to talk about the past anymore. Their presence together was enough, a quiet symbol of what reconciliation could look like. People often took photos of them standing side by side, calling them examples of change. But to them, it wasn't about fame or headlines. It was about being human, about learning, forgiving and trying again. One spring morning, the town held a unity walk, an annual event meant to bring together residents, officers, students, and veterans. The general was asked to lead the opening march. When he arrived at the park, he saw hundreds of people gathered, families with strollers, teenagers, police officers in uniform, and local leaders. As the walk began, the general noticed the officer walking quietly a few rows behind him. Their eyes met for a moment and they shared a small nod. Neither of them needed words. The walk wound through quiet streets with laughter and conversation all around. Children waved flags, people carried signs that said things like "Respect brings peace and we walk together." It was a simple event, but to the general it meant everything. It was living proof that understanding could heal what anger had once broken. Later that afternoon, the mayor took the stage and called the general and the officer forward. The crowd cheered as they stood side by side. The mayor handed them both plaques of appreciation, not for heroism, but for humanity. "Sometimes," the mayor said, "the bravest thing a person can do is admit when they're wrong, or forgive when they've been wronged." These two men showed us that growth is possible. The general didn't speak long when it was his turn. He just said, "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after them. Kindness doesn't erase the past, but it can shape the future." When the crowd applauded, the officer turned slightly toward him and said quietly, "I'll never forget that." The general smiled. That's all that matters. As the crowd began to leave, several young officers approached them to shake hands. One of them said, "Sir, your story changed how I think about this job." I'll remember this moment every time I put on my badge. The general nodded, his heart full. Then it was all worth it, he replied. In the weeks that followed, both men continued their separate paths, but they stayed in touch. They exchanged messages every now and then. Small updates, a shared joke, or just words of encouragement. Over time, what had started as a tragic misunderstanding had turned into an unlikely friendship built on respect and honesty. One day, the general received a letter from a national organization recognizing his work and promoting community trust. It invited him to Washington to receive an award. He was humbled but hesitant. He didn't like attention. Still, his family encouraged him to go. When the day came, he stood on a grand stage in front of hundreds of people, leaders, and officials. Cameras flashed as he received the award, but his speech was short and heartfelt. "This isn't about me," he said softly. "It's about all of us. Change begins in small moments, a conversation, a pause, a choice to listen. Never underestimate what kindness can do." His words were met with a standing ovation. The officer, watching from home on television, smiled proudly. He felt a deep sense of gratitude that their paths had crossed. Later that night, the general sat by his hotel window, looking out at the city lights. He thought about everything that had happened, the day of the arrest, the chaos, the anger, the pain, and how it had led to this moment of peace. Life, he realized, was full of unexpected turns. Sometimes the hardest moments were simply the start of something meaningful. He picked up his phone and sent a message to the officer. "We've both come a long way. Thank you for walking your part of the road." The reply came a few minutes later. "And thank you for not giving up on me when you could have." The general smiled softly, setting the phone down. Outside, the city hummed with quiet life, the lights stretching endlessly. For the first time in a long while, he felt completely at ease. Back in their hometown, the youth center continued to grow. More kids came each week, and some of them had even joined the police cadet program inspired by the general's talks. The officer volunteered there occasionally too, teaching about communication and empathy. Seeing them both in the same room had become a powerful symbol for the young people, proof that even those who once stood on opposite sides could stand together now. One afternoon, after finishing a session, the general walked out into the courtyard where the officer was helping a group of teens set up a basketball net. They looked at each other and laughed. "You've gotten better at this," the general teased. "Don't sound so surprised," the officer replied. "You're not the only one who learns from kids." They sat down under the shade of a tree, watching the teenagers play. For a while they said nothing. Then the officer asked, "Do you ever think about that night anymore?" The general thought for a moment. "Not the same way," he said. "I don't see it as something bad anymore. I see it as the moment that started change." The officer nodded slowly. "Yeah, me too." They sat there side by side in the peaceful silence of an afternoon filled with laughter and sunlight. The past was still there, but it no longer hurt. It had transformed into something else, a reminder of how far they had both come. As the day drew to a close, the general stood and stretched. "You know," he said, "people will remember what happened, but not just for the mistake. They'll remember what came after." The officer smiled. "I can live with that." The general looked out at the young people playing in the distance and said quietly, "That's the best ending we could have hoped for." The officer nodded, and for a long moment they simply watched the sunset together. It was a calm, golden evening, the kind that made you believe the world could still be good, as long as people kept trying, and so their story didn't end with bitterness or blame. It ended with peace. Two men who had once been strangers, bound by a single painful mistake, had become examples of how understanding can heal even the deepest divide. Sometimes life doesn't give perfect endings, but this one was close enough, honest, quiet, and full of hope, because in the end, the greatest victory wasn't in proving who was right. It was in learning how to forgive, how to listen, and how to move forward together. Time has a quiet way of moving forward, whether people are ready for it or not. Years passed since that day in the park when the general and the officer sat under the tree, watching the teenagers laugh and play. The town had changed, but in small, meaningful ways. The conversations that once began with anger now started with understanding. There were still disagreements and challenges, but people had learned how to listen. That, the general thought, was progress. He had grown older, his hair now more gray than black, but his energy remained calm and strong. He still walked every morning, greeting neighbors with the same warm smile he always had. Sometimes people stopped to talk, thanking him for what he had done years ago, and he always gave the same gentle answer: "We all just did our part." At the youth center, a new generation of young people had come in. Some of them only knew the story through videos or news articles, but they were still inspired by it. The general's calm presence made them feel safe. He didn't speak much about the past anymore, but when he did, he made sure to focus on the lessons, not the pain. He often told them, "What matters most isn't what happens to you, but what you do next. Your reaction defines you more than the moment ever will." Across town, the officer had also changed in ways no one could have predicted. He had retired from active duty at the police department after 25 years of service, and now worked full-time as an instructor at the academy. His classes were some of the most popular. Recruits respected him because he was honest. He didn't hide his past, and he didn't try to paint himself as perfect. He often began his lectures by saying, "There was a time I thought following the law meant I understood justice. I was wrong. Justice isn't only about what's legal, it's about what's right." His students listened closely. He taught them that empathy was just as important as authority, and that every badge carried the weight of trust. When he spoke about communication, his voice softened. When you meet someone, he'd say, "See the person, not your fears." The moment you stop seeing people as people, you've lost your purpose. The younger officers admired him. Some of them even said that his stories were what convinced them to join the force in the first place. One spring afternoon, the officer decided to visit the general. It had been a while since they last spoke in person. He drove through the familiar streets, passing by the same park where the Unity Walk had taken place years ago. Children were playing near the fountain, their laughter filling the air. The sight made him smile. When he reached the general's house, he saw the man sitting on his porch reading a newspaper. The officer walked up the steps slowly. "You still read those old papers?" he said with a laugh. The general looked up, smiling. Some habits never change. They shook hands, then sat down side by side. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was filled with the soft sounds of the neighborhood. Birds, the rustle of leaves, a distant radio playing. The officer finally said, "I wanted to see you. It's been too long." "It has," the general replied. "But you're here now. That's what matters." They talked for hours about their lives, about how the world had shifted in small but meaningful ways. The officer shared stories about his students, how eager they were to do things right, to earn respect the right way. The general listened with quiet pride. "Sounds like you've been doing more good than you realize," he said. The officer smiled. "I learned from the best." They both laughed softly. As the afternoon faded into evening, the officer looked around and said, "You know, sometimes I think about how different things could have been if that day never happened." The general nodded slowly. "I've thought about that too, but maybe it needed to happen. Maybe that was the only way the lessons could reach the people who needed them most." The officer leaned back thinking, "I guess so. It's strange, isn't it? Something that started so wrong ended up changing so many lives." "That's the power of how you respond," the general said. "Pain can break you or teach you. It's all in how you choose to carry it." The streetlights flickered on as the sky turned golden. The two men sat in silence again, comfortable in the stillness that only true understanding could bring. A few days later, the general received a letter from a national foundation. They wanted to create a mentorship program between retired military officers and young law enforcement trainees. The letter mentioned his name as one of the inspirations behind the idea. At the bottom of the letter, there was a note written in familiar handwriting. "I thought of this while teaching last semester. It's time we help others bridge the gap, just like we did." It was signed by the officer. The general smiled as he read it. He didn't even need to think before replying, "I'm in." The program started quietly, but it grew faster than anyone expected. Every few months, the general and the officer hosted workshops where soldiers, police officers, and civilians came together to share experiences. The conversations weren't always easy. Some were emotional, others uncomfortable, but they were honest. That honesty became the heart of the program. During one of the sessions, a young officer asked, "Do you ever forget what happened?" The general thought for a moment before answering. "Forgetting isn't the goal. remembering without hate is. That sentence stayed with many who attended. It became a quote that people repeated often, written on posters, notebooks, and training materials. Over time, the program spread beyond their town. Other cities adopted the same idea, creating spaces for dialogue between communities and officers. News stations covered it, calling it the Bridge Project. But for the general and the officer, it was never about fame. It was about people. Years continued to pass, and the bond between the two men only grew stronger. They were more like family now than friends. Every year they made it a tradition to meet at the same park where everything had begun, the park where the arrest had happened, and later, where the Unity Walk took place. They would sit on the same bench, facing the same old oak tree. One year, the officer noticed a plaque near the base of the tree. It read, "In honor of understanding, forgiveness, and the power of change." Beneath it were two names, theirs. The officer looked at the general in surprise. "Did you know about this?" The general smiled faintly. "I might have heard something about it." They both laughed quietly. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to them. That day, a group of children ran past, playing tag, their laughter echoing through the park. The general watched them with a soft smile. "That's what all this was for," he said. "So they can grow up in a world where people see each other as equals." The officer nodded. "It's happening, slowly but surely." As the sun set, the two men sat quietly again, watching the colors of the sky shift from orange to pink to deep blue. The officer said softly, "I never thought I'd find peace after what happened." The general looked at him and said, "You didn't find it. You built it." Those words stayed in the officer's heart long after that day. Months later, the general's health began to slow him down. His walks became shorter, his steps softer. But he still smiled every morning and greeted everyone the same way. The whole town respected him deeply, not just as a veteran or a leader, but as a man who had shown the world how compassion could heal. One summer evening, the officer visited him again. They sat in the garden surrounded by the sound of crickets and the faint hum of the night breeze. "I'm proud of what we built," the general said quietly. "Not the awards or the programs and the understanding. That's what lasts." The officer nodded. "You changed my life. I hope you know that." The general smiled. "And you changed mine." They didn't need to say more. Sometimes silence said enough. A few weeks later, when the general passed away peacefully in his sleep, the town mourned deeply. The news spread quickly, and people from all walks of life came together to celebrate his life. Veterans, officers, students, and ordinary citizens gathered in the same park that had witnessed both pain and healing. The officer stood at the podium, his voice calm but full of emotion. "He taught me that forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It transforms it. And through him, I learned that one act of grace can change a lifetime of misunderstanding." When the ceremony ended, the crowd walked together through the park, following the same path the Unity Walk had once taken. The air was filled not with sadness but with gratitude. As the officer walked alone for a moment, he passed by the oak tree and touched the plaque gently. "Thank you, my friend," he whispered. From that day on, the officer carried forward the lessons they had built together. He continued the mentorship program, taught at the academy, and made sure every recruit understood what the general had stood for: respect, patience, and humanity. Years later, when the officer grew old, he would still visit that same park. He would sit under the tree, close his eyes, and remember. He would hear the laughter of children, the voices of people talking with kindness, and he would know the world had changed for the better, little by little, but truly, because of two men who chose understanding over hate. And in that quiet park, their story lived on, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that grace can grow from the hardest moments, and that real strength lies not in power, but in forgiveness.